Welcome. I'm Vicky Nash. I'm Deputy Director here at the Oxford Internet Institute. And I'm really delighted to be here with somebody whose work I admire absolutely hugely, whose work we set here in the department actually to our master's students, which is Tom Standage. Tom, you probably already know, that's why you're here. Obviously, currently Deputy Editor of The Economist, with responsibility for all things tech there. But obviously also successful writer as well. I mean, we were talking earlier about the fact that you have already now 6 books under your belt, and we won't ask about sci-fi, but I gather there's a slight yearning that way. You also, according to your daughter, I noticed you have your daughter's biography. I'm not going to read it out because
it's very old, but it's quite funny. It's quite funny.
I like the bits that you liked beer, coffee, and rum. None of which obviously we're providing you with here,
Yeah.
so I feel terrible about our hospitality. And you're also very bad at gardening.
Yeah.
We probably didn't need to know too much about that. Anyway, so the plan for the rest of our session is we've got about 90 minutes. It's an in-conversation, so I'm going to throw some questions at you, which hopefully won't be too ridiculous. We'll do that for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for you guys to chip in. But if actually, you know, along the way I've asked something, you desperately want to follow up on it, please do stick up your hand. The aim is really to have a conversation and be fairly informal about this. So I thought we'd start perhaps by looking at, because I think you have a fairly unique perspective, if you like, when you write about technology. Don't laugh. No, unique in a good way. Sometimes I know we mean that in English. That's a very polite way of sort of saying something else sometimes. But no, I do think you have a unique perspective on technology, and in particular, you know, this very sort of historical approach to studying the innovations of our times. And I just wondered, you know, where does that come from, and how is that part of your way of understanding the future, if you like?
The immediate place it came from, I mean, I've always been interested in history. When I was young, I watched James Burke's Connections as well, which is a huge influence on me. Although his arguments in Connections tend to be sort of circular. So he'll start with something at work. So they don't have a kind of, he doesn't have a thesis that he's, or he doesn't have a sort of, and this tells you this, which you know, I would like. But anyway, so that I've always been interested in history and technology and the history of technology. And the specific place where all this started was when I was working at the Daily Telegraph in 1996. And it was, I studied engineering and computer science here at Oxford, and went into journalism in 1993, 4, because the internet had showed up and no one at any of the newspapers knew about it. So I started writing for The Guardian about it, and then I went to the Telegraph. And so a jolly feature that I thought I would write, since I worked at the Daily Telegraph, would be to write about telegraphs. And the idea was to contrast telegraphs, which were, you know, 19th century and slow and useless, with the internet, which was wonderful and fast, even though actually in those days it involved dial-up and was actually pretty slow and useless. But what was really funny was when I went to look at the history of the telegraph, I was actually struck by the parallels rather than the differences. And so I wrote this feature called the Victorian Internet, which ran in the Telegraph in July 1996, and then became the basis of my first book. And actually at that stage I'd been collecting examples of sort of Victorian technologies that were a bit like modern technologies. So there's a gallery in the V&A where you can see plaster casts of lots of things from around Europe, and this was one of Prince Albert's things, that it was a kind of Victorian virtual reality, that all the nations of Europe would share stuff and make plaster casts of it, and then you'd be able to go to one museum in each capital city and see kind of the great things of Europe, and he was really into it. So when they did the Great Exhibition, he got lots of people to sign up for this, and then not much really came of it except for that gallery in the V&A. But there are lots of other examples as well. La Specola, which is the museum, the Anatomical Waxworks Museum in Florence, and that again was a kind of 17th century VR. And then the Turk as a chess-playing machine was a sort of 18th century take on AI. And anyway, so I've always collected those. My original plan for the Victorian Internet was actually to do a book where every chapter was one of these historical analogies. But instead, what I've ended up doing is doing several of them as books in their own right. So I've always had that kind of interest, and then the way it sort of fits into the rest of the way I look at the world is I'm basically obsessed with the future and what it looks like, and I have 3 ways of coming up at that. One of them is to be a journalist, and to be a tech journalist in particular, because then you get to talk to the people who are inventing the future. And at The Economist, that means you can talk to pretty much anyone, and that's really fantastic. So, you know, I've talked to Bill Gates and Elon Musk and all these sorts of people, and that's fantastic. So seeing the people who are creating it and and discovering the edge cases. So I mean, I was covering telecoms in 2001. So like everyone who covered telecoms in 2001, I went to Japan to see 3G phones because they were the first country to have phones with cameras and color screens and internet access and maps and all those things that we now take for granted. So the kind of the William Gibson idea that the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. So at the moment, if you want to be driven around in a self-driving electric car, the place to go is Heathrow Airport Terminal 5. And I did this the other day. I'm writing a feature about self-driving cars and what this will be in The Economist in July. What will the world look like if we have ubiquitous self-driving cars? It's really interesting. It affects so many things. It blows up, car making, insurance, urban planning, logistics. It's really fascinating. But you can actually go and sit in one of these things at Heathrow if you go to the pod parking place, and it'll take you to Terminal 5, and you just sit in this thing and you press start and it drives you. I mean, it's unbelievable. Anyway, so there is the kind of looking for edge spaces. So that's looking for the future in the present. So that's kind of one of the three components. And then there's looking for the future in the past, which is what I do in my books. So I look for historical tales that are similar enough to things that are happening now that we can learn lessons from them, and I've done that in a number of areas, but I did it with the internet, with the Victorian internet. I did it with the debate about AI and whether machines can think with another book about the Turk, and my most recent book is called Writing on the Wall, and it's about social media, the long history of social media, which I trace back to the Romans, and that's a kind of long history of media. So what can we learn about the future of media from the history of media? And I think there are sort of very interesting long-run patterns that you can see there. So that's the kind of the book writing part. So the book writing part does history, the journalism part does the present, and then the other place I like to look for the future is by reading sci-fi, and I'm so hard sci-fi where they've done the maths and they've worked out what you can and can't do. So I'm a big fan of Alistair Reynolds, who is a sci-fi author who used to work at the European Space Agency, and I love what he does. He writes in kind of a similar vein to Ian M. Banks, who sadly is no longer producing those sorts of books. So he's very good on transhumanism and things like augmented reality. So ubiquitous augmented reality interfaces, which I think are the next thing after smartphones. It'll be another 10 years, but there are some nice computer science problems that have to be solved. You have to have centimetre level accuracy of indoor positioning, and you also need perfect head tracking. But you can do all of those if you throw enough processing power at it, and Microsoft's HoloLens is doing that. And so the sci-fi authors have sort of said, well, how would that look? We'd end up with smart contact lenses, and then we'd have implants, and we'd look at a room and it will tell us who the people we're friends with on Facebook, and that sort of thing, and it will paint information on the world and allow us to use the world as both an input device and an output device. So I think that's where computing is going next. There is a very clear trend that computers are getting smaller and closer to our bodies: smartphones, wearables, implants. So I think the sci-fi authors have really mapped all of that out. So I then synthesize those three things, and that's how I kind of figure out how to do it. The first two involve writing, and the last one doesn't. So which tells you that if this journalism thing doesn't work out, then I should be writing a series of young adult steampunk sci-fi adventures, and that's something I would quite like to do if I wasn't so busy doing everything else. So there you are.
We look forward to those. Would you have a pen name?
I don't know, actually. It's a good question. I have to think about that.
Yeah.
I probably not, actually. The good thing about my name is it's unique enough that when I sign up to new social networks, which I do all the time, and my wife is the same, we're both neophiles, and so if there's a new social network, we'll try it, bring it on. And my name is weird enough that I usually get to just be my name on these things, and I'm not into kind of pretending to be other things. So.
Not David Jones 91, no. So I will spend some time later, I think, talking more about the future, but let's spend a little bit of time looking at the history, because I do think that's really interesting. I know there are probably a few people in this room who are very familiar with some of your books, particularly the Victorian internet, which I think a lot of people here have said. But let's just spend a minute talking about that. Now, I mean, actually, in a way, I know you've had a second edition of that, so you have had a sort of an afterword.
I think I've had
three
versions of it now. So I had an afterword about phones in 2007, and then we did another edition of it last year with a foreword by Vint Cerf. Who did a blurb quote for it back in '98 when it first came out. So yes, that book just sells and sells.
It sells and sells, right? So it keeps going even as the internet develops and changes.
Well, that's what I love about it. It's been on 10 books you must read to understand the internet lists since 1998. So all of the other books from back then are completely discredited, and my book just sort of stays on that list, which is it's already 150 years out of date. So, and what was really sweet about it was that people in the industry I mean, it works on a lot of levels, that book. But people in the industry have told me that they gave it to their parents, when they were getting started on this internet thing and they were working for a startup, and their parents were like, oh, this will come to nothing. This is a terrible idea. And they were like, no, this explains why the internet is a big deal and how it fits into history, and how we are continuing this great job of wiring up humanity, which began with the Schaap brothers in the 1790s. And so it was kind of a way of explaining. And actually, I've been told the same by scientists when we write up scientists' work in The Economist. And I had this happen yesterday, actually, but when I was a science correspondent, it happened all the time. I would email a scientist and say, or ring up a scientist and say, I want to write up your work. And they'd go, hooray, I've been reading The Economist forever, and it's always been my ambition to be in The Economist. But then what they do is they use the article we write to explain to their friends and family what it is that they do, because very often it's extremely complicated and we kind of make it comprehensible. So that's a really nice connection.
I struggle with that. I should get you to my bio, actually. That'd be great. So again, for the benefit of the people in the room that haven't read it, I mean, maybe could you just sort of summarise what are the most important points of comparison, do you think, between the internet as we know it now and the Telegraph?
Well, obviously the Telegraph's very different because it was much slower, and most people didn't have wires running into their houses, so they had to go to post offices to use it. But, so the analogy is not perfect, but it's, as I like to say, it's close enough to be instructive. And in particular, things that we thought were new and people got very excited about in the 1990s, like online, new forms of crime and online romances and governments trying to prevent crypto. All of those happened on the Victorian internet, on the Telegraph. And there was a police chief in Chicago in the 1880s saying the criminal will always skim the cream from every new invention and all this sort of thing. And in fact, there are examples of basically horse race betting scams using the Telegraph that go right back to the 1840s. So the idea was that you would, if you got to the Telegraph office with the result of a horse race before the bookies representative did, you could telegraph the result to someone. And then people came up with, the Telegraph office wouldn't transmit the results of the race. So then you had to come up with a code so you could tell the person at the other end. And then they could go and place a bet in London, miles away from the racecourse, that they knew would win. So this sort of thing happens right away. Yeah. And then similarly, the online romances, people falling in love over the wires, and feeling like they know people in faraway countries, and actually, they haven't met, and then when they do meet, they either are horrified, or it feels like they've known this person all their lives. That was all happening as well. There were online weddings as early as the 1840s. Wow. And then crypto, and the government saying, oh no, we can't have this is terrible, and we need to be able to read everything, and then the ways that people find around that. So I think the fact that those all happened in the 19th century and then happened again on the internet tells you something. It tells you that there's always a tendency. I remember the 1990s, being a journalist covering the internet, you have people ringing up saying, the internet is causing more divorces and all this kind of stuff. And there is just this tendency to ascribe aspects of human nature to technology and say the technology is responsible. Facebook is the new one. Yeah. Facebook is causing divorces. Technology is an amplifier that it amplifies human nature, but it doesn't change it. And we are still basically Neolithic. Hunter-gatherers. We're running Stone Age software, and all that happens is that different technologies come along and push the same old buttons in our brains. And in fact, that's a point I can make much more forcefully with the social media book, because if you look at the way Cicero was addicted to his social channels, it's exactly the same thing. And this is why social media itself is so compelling, because it scratches a Stone Age itch about sharing and basically grooming in primates is that's what it's all about, and exchange of gossip, and it's a very, very fundamental thing. So that's really my point, that underneath it all we have human nature, I think, being the same as ever, and then these technologies come along, and something bad happens, and people go, oh, it's the technology's fault. And if you can point to a whole load of previous technologies that did exactly the same thing, then you can say no. And so you get another of my great passions is video games, and the moral panics around video games turn everyone into murderers and all this kind of stuff. And actually, violent crime's going down and video game adoption's going up. And the number of things that have been demonized in that way, I mean, it's just, there's one every sort of 20 years now. There was video nasties before that. So basically VHS, the invention of VHS was going to turn everyone into murderers before that. And then before that, there were comic books, and everyone who read comic books was going to before that was rock and roll. That was going to make you a Satanist. And comic books turned you into a drug fiend. I mean, it just goes on, and like telephones meant no one would ever talk to their friends anymore. I mean, this is just kind of standard, and this happened with the telegraph as well. It was going to affect the weather. And then on the other side, you have people saying, no, it's going to lead to world peace. So the telegraph was going to lead to world peace because obviously wars are only ever caused by a lack of communication. Yeah, sure. So if we wire up the world, everyone will understand that we're all just the same. And that didn't happen. We had World War One. And then aeroplanes were the next thing. Now, aeroplanes are going to mean that we can all fly to different countries, and we can see that we're all just the same, and so there'll be no more wars. And also, they'll make armies obsolete because you can bomb them from the air. So therefore, world peace, and that didn't happen. We had World War II. So I just think pointing out these repeated patterns is useful, and there are a particularly large number of them that would correspond to the internet in the case of the telegraph. And so that was really the joke that I was making. And the thing is, I've got to have it both ways, because there are skeptics about whether the internet really changes things or not. And at the same time, there are people who say, no, this... So there are people who say it's all happened before, and there are people who say, no, it's never happened before. And this particularly happened with the social media book. One of the skeptics on one side, who was it? There was Clay Shirky and there was Jeff Jarvis. And basically both of them thought that I agreed with them. And it's because I agreed with half of them, or agreed with each of them half of the time. So I think it's possible for something to be new, and I mean, obviously the internet is new and different and exciting, but at the same time, it's not completely new and it's not completely unprecedented. And I think the impact of the telegraph on Victorians must have been much more discombobulating than the impact of the internet on us, because they were used to news taking weeks to get around the world, and suddenly you plug in a wire and it's, there was this telegraphic demoralisation of the entire diplomatic corps, because they used to basically be kings who ran foreign bits of the world on behalf of the British Empire, and then suddenly they plug in the telegraph and they've got to explain to London what they're doing, and they start getting bossed around, and it's not as much fun anymore. So there were all of these, there were all of these big changes that happened in the Victorian period. So I think it's possible to be a bit equivocal about it and say, yes, there are obviously some things that are new and different about these technologies, but there are enough things that are old and the same that we can learn from them. And that way, I'm sort of saying it's all happened before, but I'm also sort of saying this is all new and exciting and has never happened before.
You're having your cake and eating it.
I
it's
totally
always a good position
yes,
to adopt.
Very much so.
I mean, I think you're right. We spend a lot of time here, I have to say, trying to sort of get our students to move beyond the sort of dystopian, utopian views of technology, which all really boil down to an unwillingness to take responsibility for sort of human nature and human behaviours and things.
Yes.
So yeah, I think very very much in sympathy.
But also, there's that nice spectrum. I mean, we have this Nancy Bames book, which has just been reissued, and she has. I think the best thing about it is, I mean, it's a brilliant book anyway. But the best thing about it is, in the intro, she basically lays out the spectrum of technological determinism at one end, machines make us the way we are, and then you have what you have at the other end. You have social construction of technology. Oh no, aliens don't have electrons and mobile phones and pi. Oh yeah, I'm sure they do. And then in the middle, you have the obviously sensible compromise, which is the social shaping of technology argument, which is fine, apart from the fact that it introduced the horrible term into the English language of affordances, and just basically never trust anyone who uses the word affordances. It's a very, very good rule of thumb. That means
who you are.
Yes, exactly. I'm sorry. It's just kind of pointless academic jargon. But anyway, technology gives you the opportunity to do new things which you may or may not take, and it may or may not result in new behaviours. And I think that's obviously where you have to come out in that debate. And then she kind of walks you through the examples around social media. But I think you need to be able to kind of, as journalists, we simplify and exaggerate. Yeah. But I think we also need to recognise when there are shades of grey.
Yeah. No, definitely. I mean, of course, also as a journalist and a storyteller, you're very aware that sort of the analogies that you draw obviously colour the way that we see things. And, we spend a lot of time looking at the analogies that are made between the internet and the telegraph, say. But I mean, obviously also some people say, well, no, it's not telegraph, it's the printing press.
Yeah.
So how far do you think that the analogy in your storytelling, if you like, retranslates our experience of what we're doing online?
I suppose so, yeah.
Do you think you have
there is a certain amount of that, and I think there is there are different amounts of. I think these different analogies are all helpful in different ways. Yeah. I mean, clearly the printing press was I treat the printing press in my book on social media. I don't think it's. I mean, it's a change in the same way that the telegraph is a change or the internet is a change. But I'm not sure that I don't think the analogy with the internet is very useful or very. Apart from the fact that they're a big change. I mean, they're very different, and the printing press starts the process of a centralisation of. I mean, the interesting thing about pamphlets initially is that they're totally uncontrollable. And you have Luther and his Luther writes this listicle, you know, the 95 Theses, or otherwise known as 95 crazy reasons why the Pope is wrong about indulgences.
That's right. And BuzzFeed.
Exactly. So he did BuzzFeed before anyone else did BuzzFeed. And actually, the 10 Commandments were probably a bit ahead of him there. But you get but the way that it spreads is initially. I mean, the whole point is that the church can't control, the state can't control printing, because you just have this viral spread of a pamphlet arrives in a town, everyone goes nuts about it, the printer goes, I'll have that, makes 500 copies of it, sells them, they get taken to other towns. And that happened with the 95 Theses, and, you know, made it obvious to Luther that he could use this ecosystem to spread his message. And in particular, the 95 Theses were translated unofficially into German. And so for his second pamphlet, he then writes in vernacular German, and he avoids idioms so that you can understand what he's saying throughout the German-speaking lands. And all he does is give it to the printer in Wittenberg, and then the printer makes 1,000 copies, and they go, and then they spread, and they spread, and they spread. And that's what wakes up the church and the rulers of Europe to the fact that printing is scary, and they need to try and clamp down on it, which is what they try to do. So, I mean, it's you know, so that's what's interesting about it, that it's social distribution, and it's decentralized, and you've got these kind of like super users on Twitter when Mark Andreessen retweets you, it makes a big difference, and that's essentially what the printers were. But it was still peer to peer, and that was a different. Anyway, so I think there are some interesting analogies with social media there, but I think the internet is like the printing press is not terribly helpful, except they're both big. I mean, it's like the steam engine as well, because they're both big, important technologies. But I'm not sure. I don't know. I never found the Gutenberg analogy terribly exciting.
Let's move on to talk about Mechanical Turk just a little bit, and then we'll talk maybe more about the future. Now, I mean, for me, I think that's a lovely book because of the focus, if you like, on sort of showmanship and magic, which is something we don't talk about a great deal actually in our study of technology, but I think it still plays a sort of really huge role.
Well, magic means magic and technology are the same thing. Yeah. So this is the really interesting thing. If you go back to that period, there was a distinction between white magic and black magic. So if I do a trick where so you've never seen magnets before, right? It's 1770. I've got two magnets, so I stick one of them on top of the table and one of them at the bottom, and I make one of them move around, and you go, wow, that's really clever, right? That would count as magic. It would be a magic trick, and it uses my understanding of the physical world, in other words, what we would currently call science, or basically it's an embodiment of that understanding, so it's technology. To do something. And there was a distinction made between white magic, where I do a cool trick like that using science and technology, and black magic, where I use the intervention of the devil to do it. And so, when the telegraph was first set up, it wasn't being used very much, the first line, and so the operators would do things like play chess with people at the other end of the line. And when the newspapers got wind of this, that there were people communicating at a distance and playing chess, and this was obviously occult rituals, and that had to be banned. And so the point was that, going back to the 1770s, the distinction was made between white magic, which was what turned into science, and black magic, which was bad. But they were both kinds of magic. And magic is just a word that means manipulating the world using knowledge, which sounds an awful lot like technology to me. Yeah. So I think there is less of a stick. So that's one of the really interesting things about it. And what the Turk does is it brings together two things that we kind of take for granted. Well, two of these debates. One of these debates is about the relationship between magic and technology, and the other one is the relationship between intelligence and deception. And the Turing test, and if I could build a machine that seems to be human, then it counts as under the Turing test, it counts as intelligent. So there is a sort of inherent link between deception and intelligence, illusion and intelligence, and then magic and machinery. And that's what the Turk does. So it's this machine that appears to be able to play chess in 1770, and it sparks a debate. I mean, lots of people look at it and go, well, come on, a machine can't really play chess, but they can't figure out how it's done. It's currently, we would say today, it was the first example of a cabinet illusion. So before it played chess, the operator would open all the doors and show that it was empty. And this is like one of those magic tricks where someone gets into a cupboard and you make them disappear. There are ways of doing it. But it was very, very convincing. No one had ever seen it before. So it was very innovative in that way. It was also a very, very clever piece of engineering. I mean, Kempelen was a very, very good engineer. So he had this arm that could move the pieces, and he had to have a signalling mechanism so the hidden operator, because of course there was a hidden operator, could see what was going on top of the board. But the whole thing sparked a debate about whether machines could think. And even the people who were sure it was a fake, and Babbage played against it twice, but he played against it because he wanted to see what would happen. If you make a wrong move, what does it do? Does it kind of, do all the gears explode? Does it lock up because you've done something illogical. It's like when there's an evil computer taking over the world, and someone goes up to it and says, "This statement is a lie," and it blows up. So Babbage was totally doing the same thing. He was hacking it. He wanted to see what would happen if you did naughty things. And Napoleon's supposed to have done the same when he played against it. Napoleon was not as good a chess player as he thought he was, because his generals were very reluctant to to beat him, because that would be a career-limiting move. Anyway, so what the Turk does is it prompts this whole very modern-sounding debate about whether machines can think. And Babbage, and it has some very interesting consequences. One of them is that there's a guy, Arkwright, is in a gentleman's club in London, and he hears about the Turk, and someone says, "Oh yes, I've just been and seen this machine, and it can play chess." And he said, "Well, if you can build a machine that plays chess, building a machine that can automate weaving, it must be a piece of cake." So he goes and builds one. And up to that point, no one has thought that it was possible. It must be, but he believes that it's possible. So it allows him to do this new thing. And then Babbage says, "Well, I'm sure the Turk is a fake, although I can't figure out how it works. But actually, in theory, could you build a machine that reasoned and played chess?" And at the time, he's struggling with John Herschel over navigation tables and the errors in the navigation tables. And Herschel famously says that an error in a navigation table is like a treacherous rock at sea, because it can sink a ship. You get something wrong, you crash into a coast. And so they're error checking them, he and Babbage, and Babbage says, "I wish to God these tables had been generated by steam," and he wants to have a steam-powered calculator. So that's why he goes to build the difference engine and so on. So the Turk really fits into that whole debate about where the line is between machine and human intelligence, and yet it's all happening 150, 200 years ago. So again, I find that very informative. It's also interesting that chess continues to be one of the standards that we use as a yardstick for intelligence. So in 2001, Hal plays chess, and that's how he can talk and play chess. Funnily enough, the Turk could sort of talk as well. He had a voice box. He could only say "eshek," so check. And when he put you in check, he would say "eshek." And this is because Kempelen also built he was experimenting with machines that were basically instruments, musical instruments that could talk, and he would manipulate them underneath a cloth, so you couldn't see what he was doing. But he built these machines that could say quite a few things, and they then inspired Bell, who made the telephone. So there's another connection there. But going back to the talking machine, the other thing that the Turk would do was answer questions using a kind of Ouija board by pointing at things. And the funny thing was, it would answer them in French when it was in France, and in German when it was in Germany, and that probably gave away the fact that there was a human inside pointing the thing. But again, the two things that it did that suggested it was an intelligent machine were answer questions in a Q&A session, Turing style, and play chess. And we still think that those are the kind of yardsticks that we want intelligent machines to be measured by.
Yeah. And one possibly slightly political question. I mean, what do we think of the appropriation of the term for Amazon's service? I mean, does that also hide a little bit of sleight of hand as to how those things are
that's
being
what's so appropriate. I mean, they took it from the name of my book, and they told me they were going to do it, and say because the Amazon Mechanical Turk system is basically putting an API around humans, and so you fire off a request to the Mechanical Turk API, and you get data back again, but there's actually a human hidden inside the machine. So it's a perfect analogy with Mechanical Turk, and that's why it's the perfect name for it. So that's another accidental consequence comes out of this. The other one, which is what makes it so much fun in a narrative sense, is that Edgar Allan Poe writes one of the exposés of the Turk, and in fact he does one of the best. He almost gets it. And he writes it in a particular structure, which is, there's a mystery. All the smartest people in the world try to solve it. So the French scientists try to figure out how but they fail. And then another sort of unconventional character. So this is the plot of this is how all detective stories go, right? There's a murder. The police go, "Oh, I'm baffled. I really don't understand." Then the detective comes along, makes a few apparently irrelevant observations, then puts them together into a theory, which then turns out to be true. And that is the structure of Poe's expose of the Turk, and he then starts writing detective stories, starting with the murders in the Rue Morgue, with exactly that format. So, of course, when I wrote the Turk, I wrote it in exactly that format, and I gave it that narrative structure of a detective story, where I only reveal what happens at the end, which meant I had to be an unreliable narrator for an awful lot of the rest of the book, which is quite unusual in non-fiction. But it just seemed like the right way to do it. So then you get detective stories coming out of this too. So I love all of the things that connect to the Turk. It's this wonderful nexus of interesting ideas.
Let's move on for the last 10 minutes then to look more towards the future. I mean, you said very willingly that you were happy to talk about how understanding of history can inform our understanding of the future, particularly digital technologies. You're obviously exposed to a great deal of really exciting innovation in your work at The Economist. I mean, what do you think are the most exciting digital trends to be watching in the next 5-10 years?
I think there are. Well, social media is interesting because it's a return to a sort of pre-industrial media model. So I think if you look at, so there's a whole load of interesting stuff going on there. I think if you look at the long history of media, by which I mean the last 2,000 years, for most of that period, media was social in the sense that you got information from other people. So it was media. I define media as the use of technology to convey information. So writing counts, but me talking to you doesn't. But if I sing and play the guitar, then it does because there's a technology involved. So if you do it that way, then essentially you get the beginnings of a media environment in the Roman period where you've got enough people who are literate and you've also got the means of copying and distributing information cheaply, otherwise known as slavery. So slaves are the Roman broadband, and it meant that Cicero could have dedicated slaves who copied stuff for him and delivered stuff, and he could write to his friend Atticus every day and could hear back from his friend Atticus. And within the city of Rome, you could send someone a message on a wax tablet and get a message, get an answer back within the hour. And we see this in the letters of Cicero. So essentially, of course, all media was social before the mass media because there was no mass media. I mean, there was no broadcast radio, there were no steam presses. And in fact, even in early printing, even the first 400 years of printing, there wasn't 300 years of printing. The circulation of newspapers was very small. So if you go to the beginning of the 19th century, biggest newspaper in the world is the Times, and it has a circulation of beginning of the 19th century. Biggest newspaper in the world is the Times of London with a circulation of about 8,000. And you can print that on 3 or 4 letterpress presses in parallel. And in America, the biggest newspaper, even by the 1830s, was the Courier and Inquirer in New York, and it had a circulation of 2,500. So newspapers are very, very small local social platforms. Most of the content in them is, there are no journalists writing this stuff. There might be a proprietor who will occasionally write things, but most of what they're printing is letters, speeches and stuff they've stolen from other newspapers. So it's just like the blogosphere where there's this kind of recycling of stuff going round and round. And then everything changes with the invention of the steam press, because the steam press means you can start to do millions, literally, by the 1880s, you get newspapers with a circulation of 1 million copies a day. And that hadn't been possible before. And suddenly, the barrier to entry to starting a newspaper is much higher because you need to invest in all this stuff. And then when you get radio transmissions as well, you've got more barriers to entry because it's very expensive to build the transmitters. And then there's a limited amount of bandwidth and channels, and you need to get licenses from the government and all this sort of stuff. So what you suddenly get in the 20th century is a short-term concentration of access to large audiences. So suddenly you can reach large audiences efficiently, which you've never been able to do before, but only if you've got access to this expensive gear. And so as a result of that, you get a whole load of business models and a whole load of monopolies and media empires that arise. And it's basically because of the economic short-term phenomenon that reaching a large audience is expensive. And what the internet does is blow that up. And that's why newspapers are in such trouble now, because they've lost their local monopolies. They all have to compete with each other globally. But if you look at the 2,000-year history of media, basically the weird bit is about 1850 to about 2000, because you've got this sort of strange phenomenon of, yes, you can reach a large audience, but only if you're a politician or a journalist or a businessman, and everyone else is left out. And now the pendulum swings back again to, well, actually, in theory, your tweet can reach millions. And in theory, your video can go viral. And yes, of course, you've still got broadcast as well, but you have a hybrid system in between. So what's really interesting about social media is, how do incumbent news organisations like us or incumbent media companies embrace it? Because it is it's a direct challenge to the way we do things. And we have our answer to that at The Economist, which is that we have something that we think people are still willing to pay for in this environment. Our subscribers pay us to save them time, essentially, to tell them what's important this week and what they should think about it. So I think there's a whole load of really interesting stuff happening in social. And I think the question is, the previous social environments like coffee houses, like the Roman social media, like Luther and the pamphlets, like early newspapers, were very decentralised. And if one newspaper got shut down, there were lots of others. If one coffee house got shut down, or you got thrown out of one coffee house for fighting with someone, you could go to another one. And what we're now seeing is a social environment that's actually dominated by a small number of very big players. And if you do get chucked off Facebook, that is a big problem. Yeah. So I think there is a there's a very obvious, if you look at the history of the internet, there is a very obvious anomaly in social media, which is that the web-based publishing and email work on open standards. So if you don't like the look of Google or any hosting companies, you can plug your own server into your Ethernet and you can do without them. And as long as you don't mind setting up your POP server or whatever, then you can do it. And it will talk to all the others and it will work. And that's because it's all open and standards based. It's completely different with social because social is very, very centralized. And in fact, the early versions of social media on the internet were things like Usenet, which were peer-to-peer and decentralized. The problem is, and it's a computer science problem, and it's that if you want to guarantee timely in-order delivery of status updates, which is kind of what you need to do things like Twitter, then the only way to do it, if it's going to be quick and timely and in order, then it needs to be centralized. Now, it may be that that's a soluble problem and that we can find a distributed way to do it. And there's this whole indie web movement, which is basically trying to say, let's decentralize the internet again. So I think there's a very, very interesting question of whether the current model of sort of Facebook and Twitter dominance is a short-term phenomenon in the same way that the dominance of AOL and CompuServe was a short-term phenomenon. They looked like they had a lock on the consumer internet in 1995, and they didn't. And they were blown away by standards in the web. And so what is the social media version of that? And there are lots of attempts to make open social protocols and platforms, things like tent.io, and there are loads of them, and most of them have failed. Well, they've all failed so far. But the question is, could we have an open standards-based social system, or are we going to end up with something that actually looks more like a 19th century business model or 20th century business model of centralization around Facebook? And I think that's a really interesting open question, and it's one that involves both analogies to 150 years ago and to 20 years ago, and we don't know. So that's one of the things I'm looking at, and then the other technology I'm really into self-driving cars at the moment. I mean, they are. I think
we could tell that.
Yeah,
earlier,
exactly.
Yeah.
But I mean, they are one of those technologies, and they are up there with the smartphone for their potential impact. Just a few things that aren't kind of immediately obvious about them. I mean, for a start, you don't need to own a car anymore. You summon one. Uber is building these things. Google's doing it. So it blows up car ownership. You don't need to. And then most cars are used 4% of the time. So I don't know about you, but you probably live in a street where there's just full of cars and they're just not moving. So all of those go away, and you only have cars when you need them. But what's really mad is that up to 25% of big cities, particularly in America, is parking space. And if you don't need all the parking space anymore, suddenly you've changed all the real estate values because you've got all this space in the middle of the city. So you can have parks and more housing in the centre, but you can also have much wider suburbs because it's possible to commute. You can have a 6-hour commute where you sleep in the car with a self-driving car. So you can have this amazing transformation of urban planning. And these are the kinds of, and at the moment, the way it's all being the way you read about it is like, next year when you buy this kind of Mercedes, it'll drive itself in traffic. And that's great. And the kind of assumption is that these incremental changes mean that 20 years from now, we'll all still be buying cars. They'll just be able to push the driving button. It's not going to be like that at all. They're not even going to look like cars. They're not going to have steering wheels. You're not going to own them. You're not going to have to insure them. The number of road deaths will, basically there's a 9/11 every day in road deaths, and we tolerate it. And one of the things that we will, this is another of my tests for thinking about the future. What behaviour is that's normal today will come to be seen as unacceptable in 20 years' time. And I think the fact that we let people drive cars and put up with so many road deaths will be one of them. There's a whole load of others. So overprescription of antibiotics. That's another one. Tell me. I mean, I collect these. I think it's
some more. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's a really, really good. Anyway, so those are the things that I'm obsessed with at the moment about the future.
That's fantastic. So I could keep talking for ages and ages, but I suspect other people have loads of questions. So, yes, can you say who you are and where you're from?
I'm Jordan. I'm studying public policy here. I'm fascinated by technology and public policy implications. But I haven't read your book yet. But I'm curious whether there are actually, if you have written about it in your book or not. Actually, there are historical examples that are similar to virtual reality and Internet of Things
Yes.
and 3D printing. This is all internet-based
Yes.
as well.
Funnily enough.
Can we rely on historical examples, or that we have to rely on prognosis of sci-fi based?
I think there are some interesting things about historical examples. So the Victorian plaster casts are a bit VR. There are some quite interesting early VR systems. In fact, I've just discovered another one this week, which is the Langham Dome, which was a system for training anti-aircraft gunners in the Second World War. And it was a dome. It was basically like a video game, but it was more like AR actually, because it was mixed reality. So you had a real anti-aircraft gun, and then they had these things that flew around, and you had to shoot at them, and it taught you how to like shoot in front of the planes. So I mean, there are these sort of there are lots of examples of things that from a modern perspective look like VR or AR, and panoramas. So there used to be these places you could go to, and there'd be a darkened room, and they'd make a panorama of the Fire of London or the destruction of Rome, and we kind of look at that and go, oh, that's a bit like VR. 3D printing is an interesting thing because it lets you render an object from information, and I don't think that it's hard to think how you could have done that before. So it's a very interesting technology, and it's going to allow you to pirate objects, for example. So I think the analogy there is closest with the plaster cast, but I don't think they're terribly informative. So I haven't seen any historical analogies for that one. But this reminds me of another on the VR AR side of things, Google Glass, and the kind of privacy problems that raised is very, very similar to what happened with the invention of dry plate film in the 1880s. So previously, and I actually I spent the weekend doing tintypes. I did this with my wife, she's a photographer, and so I loved it because we were doing sort of Victorian Instagram. And she loved it because it was photography, and she's one of these photographers who started with digital and has gone back to film, and the kind of bigger and more complicated and more difficult it is, the more she likes it. And it doesn't get any more difficult than having to make your own negatives using egg white and dipping things in baths in the dark, and then you've got 10 minutes to expose them, and then the exposures have to be 15 seconds long, so everyone's got to be which is why everyone looks so terrified in all these pictures. And then you have to process the picture really, really quickly, and then and you can get all of these steps wrong really easily because you have to like pour the developer on and tilt the glass around, and if you pour too much on, then it goes funny, and if you don't put enough on, then it goes funny. Anyway, so it's a miracle that anyone took pictures at all, frankly, before 1880. What happens in 1880 is they invent dry plate photography, which means you no longer have to carry a chemistry lab around with you to take pictures. And it means you can have these very small compact cameras like the Box Brownie. And there's a moral panic about it. And it's really interesting. And there's a brilliant essay by a guy called Bill Jay called The Camera Fiend. Goes into this, and he digs up all of the newspaper reports about how people are being Kodaked on the beach, and basically it becomes possible to take someone's picture without their permission for the first time, because previously you were behind this great big thing with a blanket over your head, with a tent behind you full of a chemical lab in the dark, and they had to stay still for 15 seconds. So candid photography was not an option, and suddenly it was, and so the New Yorker, so the New York Times ran this editorial saying that this was a terrible affront to privacy and what was going to happen, and in Germany they actually tried to ban photography of people without their permission, and it's a very, very clear analogy to exactly what people are saying about surveillance today, and about the real objection people had to Google Glass. It wasn't AR anyway, because it didn't do head tracking and it didn't project. I mean, it was hopeless. So we'll see it like the Mobira Senator, that 10-kilogram Nokia. It was kind of a mobile phone, but not one you'd ever actually want to use or admit to having a device descended from. But that was exactly the thing that that Google Glass meant, that potentially people could be photographing you without your permission, and we've seen this before.
Do we know when paparazzi, when the phenomenon of that emerged, is out of interest?
I'm not sure. I mean, it would have been later, because that's press photography with. I mean, it depends. I think you could say that some of the early. I mean, people were sneaking box brownies into electrocutions in the late 19th century. But I think the phenomenon of being surrounded by people with flashbulbs is slightly later. But that's just because of the invention of flashbulbs.
Yeah. Excellent. Next questions. Okay. My goodness. Okay, so Ralph, and then the gentleman here, lady in grey, and then Taha. So we'll take those four next. Ralph.
I pursue the AR theme.
Yes.
I mean, a lot of people saying Google Glass is dead and so on, but you mentioned that one of the main things was going to be recognizing faces, and I can see that being useful. And I'm not a kind of pessimist about it, but I'd like to hear your kind of take on how we interact with objects and what they can recognize and what useful things they'll enable us to do in everyday life. I mean, I've got some ideas, but I'd like to hear yours.
Well, I mean, obviously, the ability for systems to recognise faces, or indeed cats. I mean, deep learning and the fact that you can have these neural networks with a much larger number of intermediate nodes. And there's been a huge shift. When I studied all that here in the late 80s, it was very plinky plonky compared to what they can do now. So there's been an enormous change there. And Facebook has this algorithm that can recognise people. It has to have a set of people it's trying to recognise, but it has a big set of 1.3 billion of them. And you give it a picture, and it'll say, I can tell who that is, and it's like 97% accurate. So it's better than human at doing that. And there are, I think, some quite big implications from that. I mean, one of the things you could do now is you could take a gigabit image of a demonstration, say, from the roof of a building, and then a decade later you could identify every single person in the crowd. So you can no longer go to an anonymous demonstration unless you're prepared to wear a balaclava, because someone could be half a mile away and could take a high-resolution image and stick that in an algorithm 10 years from now, and they'll say, when they're holding you up for something else, they can say, I see you went to this demonstration, which is so that is a way in which AI. And that's a very limited form of it, has these sort of policy implications. There is, we did a cover on this a couple of weeks ago in the Economist. There is this big debate, and people like Stephen Hawking and Elon Musk. And Elon Musk is a very smart guy. I mean, he's he must be the smartest person I've ever met. He's terrifyingly good. You talk to him about anything, and he just goes straight. Bill Gates is the same, straight down into the detail. You start talking to him about sending dragons to Mars, and what's the difference in the heat shield thickness that you need for a return from Mars versus a return from low Earth orbit, because they're going at different speeds and all this kind of stuff. He just has it all at his fingertips. It's amazing. He expressed some concern about AI and evil AI is taking over the world. And when you've got someone as smart as him saying things like that, how seriously should you take it? Our take on all of this is that actually if you're going to worry wisely about AI, you need to worry about much more near-term things. One of them is the AIs aren't trying to take over the world, they're trying to take away your job. And there are lots and lots of examples of, the famous Martin School study of 47%, and Nick Bostrom and all of those guys. And I can't get enough of what they do. So there is that immediate near-term risk of automation of quite a lot of white-collar work, and I think that's real. And then there is the next sort of thing behind that is the example with the kind of, the surveillance and the facial recognition. And those are consequences that are visible now. And there are already, people who are on the receiving end of this as a consequence of the progress in AI in the last 10 years. And so, yes, we can worry about whether 50 years from now we'll build a generalized artificial intelligence that, does terrible things. There's some country, I can't remember which country it is in the world, that they've just set up a sort of country intranet, and they've actually called it Skynet, which is quite funny.
Really?
They've just switched it on. Is it? No, I can't remember where it is. Anyway, so our point is that rather than fixing on that thing 50 years away is a bit worrying. Actually, there are things happening today that are worrying, and we need to think about those, and we need to think about what the consequences of them are, because this dislocation in the workplace as a result of greater automation. The obvious historical analogy is the Industrial Revolution, and the problem, and it's a very informative analogy. The Industrial Revolution is the process of going from most people being farmers to most people not being farmers, basically. And it took about, here we did it first and fastest, and it took us, about 100 years between 1750 and 1850, even if you say, well, the process took, 150, 200 years, but let's say it took 100, just because that's kind of a short end of the spectrum. These sorts of changes are so rapid that they are going to change how useful someone's skills are within the course of their working life. And if you look at what the Industrial Revolution did, it prompted a massive policy response. And the massive policy response was compulsory schooling for everyone, making, basically literacy became required, because you didn't need to be literate to be a farmer, but you did to be a not farmer. And if you look at the change that's going on now, it's potentially much faster, so we need potentially an enormous policy response, and I don't see any policy response at all. And that's kind of worrying. So I think it's possible to be. And The Economist, we're generally quite optimistic about, technology creates more jobs than it destroys and all that kind of stuff. And I'm sure there are lots of new jobs that we haven't even thought of, that this will, et cetera, et cetera. But the big problem is the speed at which you have to move people from the old jobs to the new jobs is nothing like what happened with the Industrial Revolution. And we don't seem to have the policy frameworks and the the ideas to address that.
Yes, gentleman down here.
Yes, so it seems that like most of the examples you did are more about reactions to technology than to technology itself. So I wonder if it's really like technology that repeats itself, or is more like our reactions to humans that are similar to humans react in similar ways to very different things.
That's a very good point. So really what I'm writing about is the social impact of technology. And my point is exactly that the reason the reactions are the same is that human nature is the same. So the technology changes and it pushes the same buttons in our Stone Age brains. But that said, I think there are the technological analogies too, and I think they can be sometimes quite useful. I mean, just basically, if you look at the internet and the telegraph is digital, not analog. It has a two code. It has basically a binary signaling protocol. It's distributed. It's point to point. It's very much store and forward. It's very, very like the internet architecture. So there are sort of analogies there, which means when you're inventing new things, very often people have tried to solve the same problem before. And so I think the analogies do exist at the technical level as well. But this kind of agenda I have is emphasizing, so they're fun and we geeks love them. But I think the agenda I have is to say to people more broadly that the hysteria that you sometimes get around new technologies is misplaced because we've seen this movie before.
Andrew, are you coming in on that? Or is that a different question?
On the one before about automation and the changing, disappearance of Andrew Graham, sorry.
Yeah.
I don't really have an answer to the disappearance of all these jobs, but I just wanted to ask you whether you think you could get any, in terms of a policy response, whether one could get anything out of the following line of thought. At any point in time, although it's very difficult to articulate how society does this, it in principle has a choice about whether to use its investment resources to broaden the technology or deepen it. Do you replace Microsoft 2010 with 2013, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Or do you let more and more people have it? In other words, right now everybody's moving to 4G, 5G, but we could spend all the money just making sure everybody had 3G.
Yeah.
And if we spent, it seems to me, if you spent the same amount of money broadening it rather than deepening it, you'd certainly, A, slow down the rate at which the white-collar jobs disappeared, and B, allow the people who needed to come up to the next level to make it, so that they might then be able to make the subsequent.
I think you're right. I think there are a couple of problems. The main one is that we don't have a single world government that decides where we invest and which technologies we adopt. So we have instead, free markets and people have the freedom to choose. And by and large, that seems to work better than the large countries that have tried the centralised planning model. So I think that's the difficulty with that. And I think that said, one of the ways you could do the broadening part is you could say, and this is a sort of optimistic case for AI, and people make this case about robots as well. They say, we're putting a robot in to, so you have somebody who works in a lab and they have to do a whole load of laborious, repetitive processes. And so you say, well, great, we'll replace them with a robot. Or you could say, actually, we're going to get a robot, and there are robots that do exactly this. There's a Danish company that makes them. And you stick it on the side of the workbench, and you train it to do things. And then that allows the robot to do the drudgery, and then the person who used to have to do the drudgery stuff can do more useful things. And so it increases the productivity of that worker. So these are called cooperative robots. And you can make the same argument with computers that, did computers replace jobs? Well, they kind of did, because we all became our own secretaries and did our own typing. But at the same time, they made us much more effective and increased our productivity. So you can make exactly the same case with AI. A lovely example is Gary Kasparov says that the best chess players in the world are no longer humans or machines. They are actually teams of humans supplemented with software. He calls them centaurs because they are half machine, half man, which is a nice way of looking at it. But the point is that they are more productive working with the machinery, and it's not a kind of zero-sum, the machine wins or the person wins thing. So I think that's probably where the kind of thing you're suggesting would work, which is, can we deploy technology in a way that improves people's productivity rather than sort of just getting rid of them. But there are obviously going to be some things like, do we need so many? I mean, the main cost when you go to taxi is paying the driver. So if you get rid of the driver, you can make taxis much cheaper, and then you don't have to have cars. And there are so many benefits to doing this, and there aren't that many taxi drivers. There's only 13,000 in New York. So, do we really need to not adopt this technology just to protect their jobs?
I should point out, yes, Media Economist, who just asked you that question. Right, lady over here.
Hi, Dani Papamaximou, School of Engineering.
Hooray.
Excuse me.
Hooray, School of Engineering. So,
Yeah. Just if you have
Like
an
the
analogy, like with the Victorian era, when you used the social media paradigm, maybe you have something similar to your experience that we go to the democratization of education via the internet, because at the moment we have two main distributors of papers, which basically do not have any inputs in the academia apart from distributing to paid members. I'm talking about, the main players.
So you mean this kind of the science journals are open
Yes.
open access and that kind of thing?
They're not open access,
Yeah.
I'm afraid. So has this been? I'm sure that before the Industrial Revolution, there was the educational evolution where literacy became compulsory. Will this happen, you reckon, now? Will we be able
Well,
to
I think
access?
literacy became compulsory after the Industrial Revolution. It was a response to the Industrial Revolution. But if you look at the origins of scientific publishing, right here in Oxford, in fact, and it was Oldenburg, wasn't it? And he was the kind of telephone switchboard for the scientists of Europe, and they would all send him stuff, and he would say, "Oh, I know who's working on this," and they'd really appreciate this. And so he had this informal role of just connecting everyone together. And then they started to see his. They realised if you were a scientist and you discovered something, the quickest way to tell everyone about it and also establish your priority was to tell Oldenburg. So the beginning. So basically, you had a social network of scientists, and the early scientific journals were kind of a form of social media because they were a way of writing to all of the scientists instead of just writing to one of them, and ensuring that things. Also, the way that they checked. So which one was it? It was one of the who discovered the rings of Saturn. Dutch astronomers, family of Dutch astronomers, can't remember their names. So one of them wanted to submit a paper to the Proceedings of the Royal Society. So they would, the way they would check is by sort of referring. So it was like a sort of friending system. I think going back to your analogy with universal education, there were attempts to do this. So there were these sort of, there were the penny universities of the coffee houses, and the idea was that anyone could go to a coffee house, and as long as they paid a penny and bought a dish of coffee, they could chat to people, and you were supposed to leave social distinctions at the door. So you got ideas crossing social barriers in a way that they couldn't. Again, something starts here in Oxford in this country. And so you get scientists demonstrating, doing lectures, and people went to scientific lectures and learned about astronomy and mathematics, and there was this great wave of we can learn anything, and people called them penny universities. So that was one of them. There were also these sort of discussion societies. There were a few examples of this in France, and I mentioned this in my book, where people would get together and they would have these Q&As, and the idea was that no one said who they were when they asked or answered a question, because the important thing was what you said and not what. And again, it was a deliberate abolition of social status in order to facilitate the movement of information. So those are things that came out of publishing and publishing systems like coffee houses and the network of coffee houses that allowed more people access to information. Obviously, the printing press did this too. One of the complaints that Erasmus makes when the printing press shows up is that, and this is a kind of classic, the classic complaint, we now see that it fits into the pattern that new technologies are always accused of trivializing communication. What Erasmus was complaining about was that everyone was reading pamphlets, and in particular Luther's pamphlets, and this was distracting them from proper reading, by which he meant Cicero and the classics, and no one was reading the classics anymore. They were all reading news books and pamphlets. But the point was that there was definitely a broadening of access that the printing press made possible as well. So I think there are a few analogies like that. I think in the modern one, I think it's possible to overstate we don't know what the impact of online learning is going to be. A lot of people who do it are doing it in the way Bill Gates does it, which is I'm a little bit interested in this, so I'm going to do a little bit of this course for a little while. And that's great, that's fine. And it means that the dropout rates being very high is not a problem. But I think we haven't really seen how that plays out. I suspect that at the moment what we're trying to do is shoehorn the current undergraduate and postgraduate degree model into an online system. And actually, if you look at where the real action is, like LinkedIn buying Linda and Skillshare and all this kind of stuff, what's actually happening is people don't care about qualifications, they care about skills. And so what we see is, a friend of mine was telling me this. He was in the New York office of The Economist the other day. He was there late, and as he was leaving, saw one of his colleagues there, and she was doing something on the screen. He said, "What are you doing?" She was doing a course. She works in the marketing department. She was doing a course in UX design, because she recognises that more and more marketing deals involve apps and websites, and she doesn't know about UX. And she recognises that she needs to have those skills to prosper in that business. So she's paying $600 to do a course in UX design from God knows who on the internet. That is the kind of thing that I think makes a difference. Being able to pick up, and this is why LinkedIn has bought Linda, being able to pick up those individual skills. And I think what we're currently trying to do is put the old wine of degree courses into the new bottles of the internet. So it's going to happen in some way, but I'm not quite sure how. And I don't have a single historical analogy that helps me determine that.
And it's very early days.
It is
isn't it?
really
that's
early.
The thing. It's very too
Yeah.
far too young to tell. Yes, Taha, and then we'll take a couple more.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Taha Gasseriya, research fellow here. I'd like to know more about the Victorian big data and recommendation system, because I think that this new understanding, the digital quantitative understanding of human societies that we are gaining now, thanks to internet and digital technologies, would fundamentally change our lives, unless you could disappoint.
No, that's a good point. There weren't that many big data sets for people to crunch on. The one that comes to mind is the head of Western Union, which is the monopoly telegraph provider in the US by about the 1880s. And they argued, they had some very Microsofty arguments. They said things like monopoly was good because it meant there was standardization. And they said monopoly was good because it meant companies didn't waste their time competing with each other. So they were trying to tell you that having a monopoly was good for everyone. And then they got wiped out by telephones because they thought telephones were useless. So ha ha. And now all they do is money transfer in Africa. So and they're getting wiped out by mobile phones again. So it's kind of they missed the phones the first time and they missed them the second time. But anyway, the boss of Western Union, and I can say this in the Victorian internet. He notices that you can use telegraphic activity as a proxy for economic activity. So it's very much like the, there are lots of examples of using mobile phone data as a proxy for for traffic speeds or for flows or then for economic activity. And he says he can tell you what's going on in the US just by looking at the patterns that come, basically how much business are the different states, the different cities doing in selling telegrams, and how many of them are at business rates, and how many. And he says, you can kind of take the pulse of the whole economy. So he's starting to get into kind of real-time analytics.
Information sort of overload or ever-growing expansive information is one of the most significant trends that we've seen.
Well, information overload goes back to the telegraph in the 1870s. Yeah. So I actually have a whole chapter on this in the Victorian internet, and I think the impact in those days was much worse than what we see today, because the example I give is stockbrokers. So previously you went to see your stockbroker once or possibly twice a year, and the stockbroker got his prices updated once or possibly twice a year. So he'd say, well, I think the price of tea is going to go up this year, so why don't we buy some tea stocks? And we go, okay, we'll buy some tea. And copper's going to go down, so we'll sell copper. Okay, fine, that's fine. And then a year later you'd find out what happened. And then what happens is they plug in the telegraph networks, and suddenly all the prices are being updated every hour, and then the stockbrokers' clients are going, copper's up, copper's down, buy, sell, and they're sending all these messages. And so they had this big gala dinner for Samuel Morse in the 1870s in New York, where he was hailed as all sorts of ridiculous poetry, and he was going to herald world peace, and he was the greatest. He'd reunited Britain and America, and he was the greatest man since Columbus, etc., etc., etc. And then there's this guy called William Dodge, who's a businessman, and he kind of gets up and he kind of sounds a rather discordant note among all this celebration, and he says, well, actually, I'm not sure that the telegraph has been an entirely unmixed blessing. For business people like me, it means, it never stops, and we're constantly on the dash, and so this was a transformation that happened within a few years of those people's lives, of going from the acceleration going from once a year to once an hour, and really all that's happened since then is that we've found ways to increase the bandwidth of the stuff that we can get more often. So so I think this kind of feeling that we're being overwhelmed by stuff is and people felt the same. Romans complained that everyone was writing books, and that people worried when the printing press appeared that suddenly there were more books. And previously it was kind of possible to read all the books in the world that you needed to read. If you were Erasmus had basically read everything. And then the printing press meant that he hadn't read everything anymore, and there was no chance he'd ever be able to read anything. And what's really interesting is what happens with when this really gets going. So there's a fantastic book on this called, was it Too Much to Know? What's that book called? It's about the history of information overload. What's really interesting is the technologies that are invented when the printing press really gets going to deal with this. And they are things like tables of contents, indexes, and book reviews. Because book reviews tell you which books to read, and then tables of contents and indices tell you how to find the bits in the book you're probably interested in. And they are responses, they're technological responses to the feeling of information overload. And what we have today is we have lots of pages on the internet, and we invented search engines. And search engines are kind of okay at finding some of the stuff you want if you know how to use them. But we haven't really developed very good tools yet for sifting the wheat from the chaff. And that's an opportunity for the internet because we can do the sifting using humans. But we're really at a very early stage of doing this, using social signals in searching, using AI to say, hey, my assistant, find me all the stuff I'd be interested on this. That is how we deal with it. So I think all that's happened is that you get these periods where the technology can deliver stuff faster than we think we can cope with it, and then the technology has to catch up to give us the tools to filter it again. And we saw that with print, and now we need to happen with the internet.
Two more questions over here, lady in the middle, and then you.
I'm a fan of The Economist.
Thank you.
But what you said was really interesting is that a little bit earlier, you said that it people trust you to decide what things you want to know and what people should think about what's happening. And I just wonder if you want to say anything a little bit, maybe Big Brotherish about information or about social bubbles.
I'm kidding.
Or,
I mean, basically that's
yes,
social bubbles. I mean, basically we have, for example, we have a cohort of Economist readers who are people who work for NGOs, and they hate our politics. They'd say we were too right-wing and pro-market, although they'd agree with us on social issues. So they kind of hold their noses and subscribe to The Economist because it's the best place to get Africa coverage, because we have a ring-fenced Middle East and Africa section every week. So the Africa stories are not competing for space with stories about royal babies or Lady Gaga, which they are in a daily paper. So basically, we know our readers are intelligent enough to say, look, I read The Economist because I want the reporting, but I totally disagree with their line on this or this or this or this. So we're not naive enough to think that whatever we say about things is what people believe. But that said, there is certainly a part of it is give you an opinion at least, even if it's not what you agree with. What should you say if you meet someone and they talk to you about this? And we did this advert with Henry Kissinger where there's someone sitting on a plane and Henry Kissinger sits down next to them and goes, right, what should we talk about? And it's like, so there's this, that has always been the kind of Economist promise, which is that you read this, you will not look like an idiot when someone asks you about something that's going on in the world. And you may not agree with our line on that thing, but so the famous encapsulation of this is from Larry Ellison of Oracle, who is an Economist fan, as is Bill Gates, as is Sheryl Sandberg, lots of tech people like The Economist. And Larry said, I used to think, now I just read The Economist. And he's kidding, but there is a kind of, he realised that there were lots of, there was no point in him agonising about thinking about, certain subjects when actually smart people he trusted had thought it all through for him. And so if he wanted to know where he'd have probably ended up, he could read The Economist. And so there is a certain sort of grain of truth to that. On the filter bubbles, I think the filter bubble hypothesis is half right. I don't think it's completely true. On the one hand, it's true that the Facebook algorithm means that you see more stuff from your friends that you agree with, and I do try and find Republicans who are not mad to follow on Twitter, because otherwise it's just sort of liberal Americans, and I'm living in a bubble of people who just think Republicans are idiots, and they've got to be some smart ones out there somewhere. It's quite hard to find them sometimes. So I totally buy that side of things, but I think the idea that this is making things worse is wrong, because if you look at the way the media environment used to work, we had 3 or 4 channels on the TV, and every household would get one newspaper, and that meant they had a far smaller diversity of views they were exposed to through the media than you can get now. And now you can read all the newspapers online, and it's very obvious that people do read newspapers they disagree with, because that's why you get flame wars in the comments. And the statistics show very clearly that people are much more promiscuous about their news consumption digitally than they are in print. So that must mean that, and the guy who built Google News did it because he was Indian and he felt that the Indian papers weren't giving him a sufficient variety of viewpoints, and he thought this was sort of a democratizing thing to allow people to find all of the news sources in the world. So, and I think that's true. So I think actually you do have a much greater access to things. You're much more likely to be exposed to opinions you disagreed with than you were in the 1950s, where oh, we won't have that kind of talk here, and no one will mention that opinion. And now actually, my kids will say to me, "What's this and what's that?" about the news, and that wouldn't have happened before. So I think there's some truth in it, but I think the idea that this is sort of, but I think the worry about it is overblown, basically.
Hi, so I'm Yin, I'm a DPhil student here, and I'm just wondering what you think are the top 3 skills, shall we say, that differentiate humans from machines, i.e. skills that machines just cannot really ever learn. So, for example, can machines be creative?
I think they can, but I think we sort of say that doesn't count. I mean, there are lots of machines that have composed music and things like that, and we just happen not to like the music. And I think if you have people done double-blind tests where they've not told people that this music has been composed by a machine? I don't know. Do we want machines to compose music? I don't know. Maybe we do. I mean, I'm not sure there's really an answer to those questions. I mean, every time anyone says that machines will never be able to do this, it's a challenge to people to go and the history of AI is a history of moving the goalposts, right? So every time someone says, oh, you'll never get a machine to do that, so someone, like driving a car, never get a machine to do that, they build a machine to drive a car. Well, that's not AI, that's just engineering, and then they move the goalposts again. And we've just seen that again and again and again. They can land planes and they can, read medical scans and so on. Driving cars is a really interesting one because it looked like an insoluble problem whenever they did the first grand challenge. I think it was 2004. And so DARPA said to all of the computer scientists of America, you build a car that can drive this 50-mile course. So something like 15 of them tried it. Most of them didn't get off the starting line. The one that got furthest went something like 2 miles and then fell into a ditch and then caught fire. So DARPA was sort of like, oh God, because they wanted to build autonomous vehicles for use in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so it really looked like they'd set the bar too high. But the really interesting thing was the next year, everyone came back again, and something like 15 of the cars completed the course. 15 of them got further than the best car had the previous year, and like 5 of them completed the course. What was really interesting that it had gone from an insoluble problem to a soluble problem in a year, and it had been independently solved by 5 different groups. So all the car makers looked at it and said, hang on a minute, if Carnegie Mellon could do it, and Stanford could do it, and all these other people can do it, we could do it too. So they all started doing it. So it was just like Arkwright and the Turk and the Loom. Once you're told that something's possible, your preconceptions that it's going to be too hard seem to go away, and then you've told someone else has solved it, well, we must be able to do it. And so self-driving cars, are advancing very quickly. So I think it would be dangerous to say that anything is something a computer can't do. But I think there are some things where, do I want to go to a concert where a robot plays the violin? I don't know. It might be quite awesome actually, but I might actually want to listen to a human do that. So I think judging them by the same standards starts to become not the right way to look at it. But good question.
This is something they address in superintelligence and so on, in terms of intelligence is defined by humans, around humans.
Yes.
If you set, for example, intelligence tests that are based around what monkeys do, then the monkeys beat the humans at the intelligence test.
No, that's exactly right. So there's social construction of intelligence. Surprise, surprise. I think that's absolutely right.
You talk there about the idea that we sort of you define the test, then it becomes a challenge, if you like, to people to design machines to do things in new ways. Do you see from the work that you've done in The Economist, do you see areas where actually there are significant social challenges which are underinvested in terms of say digital tech, for example?
Yes. So this is a classic Economist kind of subject, and it's also a classic historical analogy. So the Longitude Prize is where this all starts, and we all know what happened there. And then there were various prizes for aviation, and in recent years we've had the reintroduction of prizes. So the X Prize for getting into suborbital flight, and we have argued there's a really specific example now, which is antibiotics. So antibiotic resistance. So the problem, in fact, there are lots of orphan diseases, but in particular, Tom Lehrer's old joke about diseases of the rich is actually not a joke. Pharmaceutical companies concentrate on drugs that they can sell to rich, ill people in the rich world because that's where the money is. And they are not incentivized to produce drugs that they won't make much money on treating billions of people in the developing world. So what do you do about that? And the answer is you change the incentives and you come up with prizes, and those are the most obvious examples. And we've seen several cases of that, and there's some initiative to do this now. But you have a prize fund and you guarantee a certain price and all this kind of stuff. And so there's a market failure and you address it using basically a competition, and that's something that we love at The Economist. We're big fans of that. So I think that's probably the best example.
Yeah. Probably time for one more question. Otherwise, I've got another one I want to ask. Anybody else? Yes.
Couple of things. The first thing is a relatively boring question. I wanted to pick up on your point about the Africa coverage in The Economist. Just on a really basic production level, is that a minimum page thing a week, or is it just that there is a dedicated sort of...
Oh, it's minimum pages. I mean, it's if you look at so we have a section that says Middle East and Africa, and it's always 4 pages long or something, and some weeks it's 5. Okay. So it is ring-fence space for that subject, and that is not how most newspapers have a foreign section. The Daily Telegraph, hilariously, polled its readers because it noticed that no one ever read the foreign. So it did a survey of who actually read what. And of course, they all read the celebrity stories and all this bit, and no one was reading the foreign stories. So they then said, well, look, no one's reading these stories, so would you mind if we took them out of the newspaper? And everyone said, no, we want them to be there. So they want the option to read the boring foreign stories that they never actually read, but they don't actually want to read them. And in our case, people are subscribing because they want them, so they're much more likely to read them. And that's one of the things that we're doing that most people are. No one else is trying to do a global newspaper for the world, and if they did, we'd have some competition. But it's quite a hard business to do because you have to, and especially at the price we do it, we can do it at that price because people trust us to do it well. And to sort of come into that market at a high price would be quite hard.
Okay, and then my second question would be, outside of your Economist hacked digital strategy thing, do you, in terms of the relationship between mass media and social media and whether or not, because newspapers were initially, I remember, were a little bit freaked out by the Telegraph and kind of thought that newspapers were going to die.
Yeah, there's a lovely analogy there. So I wrote a piece about that exact thing, which was that telegraphs were going to destroy the newspaper industry, just like the internet was going to destroy the newspaper industry.
So do you think the social networks have the same sort of, or are generating the same sort of crisis?
I think they are. Yes, I mean, and the same. And again, there's some truth in it. This is definitely a challenge to the business model. And it's definitely the case that quite a lot of news that, social networks are mainly used to distribute news from actual news organisations. But what the internet really means is that you don't need as many of those news organisations. We had far too many newspapers because they had local monopolies. And they had local monopolies because of this short-term economic factor that you needed expensive machinery to reach a large audience. Don't need that anymore, so all the newspapers are now competing with each other globally, and that means you need far fewer of them.
So it's not that they can't both survive. It's
just they'll still be exactly. So I think the way to look at it, this is a golden age for news. I mean, news consumers have access to more sources of news than ever. It's undeniably a good thing. It's just a terrible, terrible time to work for a newspaper because there are going to be fewer of them. But no one owes the newspaper industry a living. Although the newspaper industry would see things differently. But but funnily enough, when the newspaper industry was writing about the car makers or the coal miners, they were saying that the world owed them a living too, and the newspapers would be like, no. So the idea that your industry is special and deserves government intervention is something that all industries believe, and so we don't believe you should make that case for news. I think there are going to be enough newspapers, and there are going to be fewer than there were, but no, I mean, the idea that you can replace what newspapers do entirely with social media, I think is not the case. I think there will just be a smaller market.
So last question for me, I guess, actually, particularly listening to you over the last hour and a half, I'm struck by a sort of seeming sort of, I don't know, sort of, not inconsistency, but it's a contradiction, I suppose. That on the one hand, you're repeating these really sort of important points that we all know actually about the persistence of human nature and the idea that technologies don't change that. And yet on the other hand, obviously you're part of the same industry, particularly sort of tech journalism, which is often responsible for sort of the hyperbole around how far. So what are the responsibilities, do you think, of say being a journalist in the tech sector?
Well, so that's basically my role, which is to talk about things, but to talk about them in a in a way that maybe has a bit more historical perspective. And I think the perspective needn't be critical or sort of overly supportive. It just is perspective. So some of the time, it will say so with driverless cars, for example, I think they are a very exciting technology, but I'm not writing about them. I'm putting historical analogies into the article I'm writing about them, just to sort of clarify. There are some people who are going as far as saying this is going to, there will be no more traffic jams because the cars will all, avoid each other and all this kind of stuff. People said exactly the same thing about the advent of cars originally, that replacing horse-drawn carriages and horses with cars was going to mean that there'd be much less traffic on the streets, because they just assumed that every carriage would be replaced by a much smaller car, and the fact that more people will be able to afford cars hadn't occurred to them. And there are so the same sorts of mistakes are being made with driverless cars, and so there's some very, very interesting modelling being done about when driverless cars are cheap and ubiquitous, what's the demand response, because that will create more demand. People will be able to make a lot more trips than and so some of those studies suggest that actually you do end up with not more cars on the road, but you end up with more passenger kilometres. So unless they're electric cars, that's bad because that's more emissions. So I think we need to. I think we can. The extent to which we are, it's not always scepticism, but it's sort of historically informed perspective. I think is the thing. And sometimes it will make you sceptical about things, and sometimes it will make you more optimistic about them. But the main thing is to have that perspective.
Well, you do it phenomenally well, and we are delighted to have had a chance to hear about it from you personally tonight. Thank you so much. Thank you.